I'm going to get started now. Right. So without further ado, welcome to the IAS, both virtually and live. If you are here joining us in International House, you will notice possibly if you are on screen that both Marian Arnold, who is going to give the more formal introduction to Jean today, and I have some amazing real life prints of the work that you will be seeing today digitally here in International House. They have been here for the whole of the week, and a number of people have actually come to International House specifically to be able to see them live. So it's been very wonderful and dynamic to be able to have those here, and we're thrilled by that. It's my great pleasure to be able to be welcoming a visiting fellow, Jean Brundrit, whom I have known for a number of years, actually, and welcoming her back to Loughborough, but also very specifically to be opening up this particular seminar today, because one of the things that we are very keen to pursue through the IAS here in Loughborough is an interdisciplinary approach to areas of interest and topics of interest. And this project is remarkably interdisciplinary, and we are thrilled to be able to be having an interdisciplinary audience and discussion that really brings the arts and sciences together here in a very profound and exciting way for the notion of the environmental humanities and for the idea of the pivotal role that creativity can play in thinking about key issues such as Arctic and polar and Antarctic melting and ice flows, and major issues around climate change that are affecting all of us. So we are thrilled to be able to have some of those kinds of conversations here at International House and online with colleagues. So please do feel free to ask questions, and I'm going to be turning over to my colleague Marian Arnold now to do a more formal introduction for Jean today.
Thank you very much, Marsha. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jean Brundrit. She is an associate professor in the Michaelis School of Art at the University of Cape Town, where she teaches photography. The UCT website lists her academic achievements, and so I'm not going to be repeating them. Instead, I want to make a few comments on what I know about Jean and how I respond to her work, especially that which she created in Antarctica, now the subject of her hot off the press book, Over the Horizon. I know Jean as a dedicated, empathetic, and innovative teacher who consistently combines her pedagogical principles with her own practice-based research. And what I recall clearly from the time when we were colleagues is Jean's enthusiasm for how photography creates images. This still tantalizes her. The key factor is light, the same element that activates the sensitive rod and cone cells in our uniquely structured human eyes, enabling us to see. Pinhole photography is a basic way of making an image. It requires a light-proof box with an aperture formed by a pinhole, through which the light passes onto light-sensitive paper and creates an image. It is entirely unsurprising to me that Jean was and still is a devotee of pinhole photography. She remains fascinated by light, the passage of time, and the problematic but seeming reality of the world presented as an image by a tool with a transparent lens called a camera. Through a leap of imagination and scientific curiosity about deep time, Jean is now experimenting with ice as the lens through which light can pass. So how might we name the pictures that Jean has created with her ice lens? What are we looking at? The issue of naming camera-produced imagery puzzled the mid-19th century art world and photographers who worked with the early cameras. The results of their deliberations about image-making technology resulted in labeling the new images documentary and art photography. Documentary was defined as the result of capturing real life through a viewfinder, while art photography artfully organized and manipulated the scene to be photographed to meet aesthetic or narrative intentions, a strategy also practiced by painters. The problem of such binary classification is that it presents either or thinking. The challenge for risk-taking photographers is entering the space between polarities and inviting viewers to participate in the making of meaning generated when photographs tease our imaginations, memories, and knowledge, rather than proposing photographs as a singular truth. Jean has worked with documentary as a tool for workshops aimed to empower disadvantaged community groups in South Africa. But in her own work, messages and meanings emerge and are not prescriptive. That is not to say that they do not serve a social role. On the contrary, Over the Horizon alerts us to valuable alliances between art and science and ways in which the collaboration can generate fusions between quantitative data and qualitative responses to the damage we are doing in the Anthropocene era. Jean's father, Jeff Brundrit, is an emeritus professor of physical oceanography, so she's had a lifetime of knowing the importance of water for sustaining life or gaining control over human inhabited land masses. During her participation in the residency program that Marsha and I initiated as part of the culmination to our residency, our feminist-generated homeland project 10 years ago, Jean used the residency days to study Loughborough's canal system and to ponder on how water reaches the seas and circulates globally. The rhythms of water are stilled in the frozen Antarctic, and Jean will be talking today about the 6 weeks she spent aboard a research ship, the SA Augullus, photographing the spacious environment of the ice shelf, sea ice, ice pack, and the sea. The results of her Antarctic work bring me back to the issue of vision. Jean viewed the icy world through an ice lens, but she made choices about how to position her viewfinder and which photographs to select for presentation to an art-interested public, scientists, and photographers. We view the work through our own unique cognitive lenses and knowledge. However, the resonance of content and aesthetics emerges from long, slow looking and musing on the evocative power of a dialogue between ambiguity and clarity created by light and time, as well as by Jean Brundrit's hands which handle her cameras and shape her ice lenses, and her sensitive eyes, and of course, the ice lens themselves. Speaking metaphorically, the ice lens may reflect on the light penetrating its icy form to reveal the changed nature of its age-old identity. Speaking realistically, I hope it will not have been a witness to its own demise. And now over to Jean.
Thank you very much, Marion, for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank Marsha and the Institute of Advanced Studies here at Loughborough for hosting me in this, for the seminar and in this time. I'm going to start by talking about my association with Loughborough and the project that Marion mentioned, the Homeland Project, that I was a resident for here in 2012. And just to show you the image that I made for that residency, which was a 3D laser scan of a wave that was initially shown on a billboard that I reworked for a gallery presentation in Cape Town. And for the way this was made, and really this talks to my interest in how technology influences the way we look, is I worked with land surveyors and their equipment at the edge of the sea to scan a wave as it moved through the area of measurement. Following that project, I moved on to a book project called Big Sea, which was a combination. It's an A5 book, so quite small, a combination of a number of images. Firstly, my own images of the sea, and then images taken by Captain Shannon in the Western Antarctic in the late 1920s. He was master of the ship, the William Scoresby. This isn't one of the images that appears in the book, but just to show the ship and the images that he took of Antarctica. And I suppose I'm really thinking about this in terms of my current Antarctic project, because it was a lead in to the research that I would be doing later on in 2019 when I went to Antarctica. So these are some images from the book. And in this instance here, the image was so big, it had to extend over across two double page spreads. And what I would like to do now is show you a 3-minute movie that introduces my current project. And my amazing technical assistant is just getting that up for me. So enjoy. And so it begins. I sit up in bed, switch off the light and open my curtains. I can see layers of velvety black with the sky slightly lighter than the sea. Dark-shaped birds fly past, indistinguishable in the gloom. A few stars are visible. The lighthouse at Slangkop blinks, blinks. I see you, see me. The lighthouse flashing in the night is the last land we will see for a while. The night will recede too, the further south we go into the light. In December 2019, I travelled to Antarctica from Cape Town on board a research ship. I spent 2 weeks off the ice shelf on the ship. During the voyage, I photographed the world around me, the ice shelf, the sea ice, the sea. I photographed through a lens made of ice. The lens responds to the environment. The temperature and wind cause it to melt, and any airborne snow or ice adheres to its surface, shifting what it sees as I expose the film. As the ice lens melts and changes shape, the focus, which is tenuous to begin with, shifts. My idea behind this project arose from a thought I had while photographing ice in my photographic studio in 2016, when I speculated if ice shaped into a lens could form an image, and if it could, how would ice see the world? At that time, I made a convex lens out of clear ice and photographed with it. The resulting image revealed enough information to decode form and detail. The photograph reminded me of the optical phenomena I had read about in books detailing Antarctic expeditions, where all is not what it seems, where horizon lines can be difficult to discern, where mirages occur, where the atmosphere can bend light around the Earth's curve, and more than one sun can be in the sky at the same time. Once I had established that ice shaped into a lens could form an image, photographing in Antarctica seemed the logical extension of this idea. This is the project that took me south. On the ship, and just to start, this is the ship that I was on. It's the SA Agulhas II. It's a South African research vessel. And this is what made it possible for me to travel to Antarctica. Sorry, right. So just to go through, and I'm going to pick up on some of the things that I talked about in the film. I modified a lens barrel. I had worked with a technician who removed all the glass from the lens so that I could insert my ice lens into the lens barrel, but still have the working mechanisms of the shutter and aperture. And this is the camera I photographed mostly with. That is the lens from that camera. I worked out a method of making clear ice by looking on the internet, which is how we mostly do our research. And by using directional freezing, could make a band of clear ice, which initially I used a hacksaw to cut to the right dimension, but later on I worked out I could melt it, which worked better. And then I prepared kind of camembert size pieces of clear ice that I packed in Ziploc bags and took with me on the ship. So I took ice to Antarctica, and part of the reason was that I was unsure if the movement of the ship would influence my ability to make clear ice aboard. This is me working in the lab on the ship. I had access to the science laboratories to cut the ice. As you see, my equipment is quite rudimentary. I was using a serrated kitchen knife and working neatly to shape the ice lens. There we have a final shaped ice lens. And once they were shaped, I put them back into a Ziploc bag and put them in the freezer ready for when I needed to photograph. So there's quite a lot of preparation beforehand. This was my fridge in my cabin, full of film. And the next few pictures are me photographing with the different cameras I used. I photographed with a 4x5" camera, but most of the images I made that I've actually used were photographed with a medium format camera. This is me photographing at the back of the ship. So in my full weather gear, but quite difficult to work with gloves, so I obviously took them off. And then after photographing, I went back into the laboratory and processed my film. I had worked out a methodology whereby I wasn't discarding chemistry. I was reusing my developer. I was washing my film in very, very little water. And then that was my view from the sink where I was processing. And then I would hang my film up to dry in my shower. And something that maybe isn't obvious about being in the South is that it's incredibly dry. So my film would dry very speedily, over about 15 minutes. I then cut the negatives up, pasted them to my window in an improvised light box, re-photographed them with my DSLR, put those images onto my computer, adjusted them, and printed them out with my mini printer that I took with me, and formed a working exhibition as I went along. So I only processed my black and white film on the ship, but by doing this, I could see and hone my skill as the 6 weeks progressed, which was the length of the journey. So in a sense, this was a self-directed artist's residency. I had very little to do apart from work and take photographs. So I was incredibly fortunate in that. This is a photograph of the nice empty laboratory. And then just to contrast, this is the laboratory during semester. And the reason I've put this up is I got to be on the ship through my involvement with a science education program for postgraduate students called Semester. I've been on the ship now, I think twice, 3 times, 3 times. And while I am not a scientist and my background is in fine art, the person who has conceptualized this program incorporated art as an important aspect for postgraduate science students, and also as some kind of relief from their science learning during the voyage. So this is science students making artwork. I have my colleague Alex in the white t-shirt teaching something called fold scopes, which are a nifty invention which turn your cell phone camera into a microscope. And then in the bottom right hand corner is a collage workshop run by my colleague Svea Josephi. And then on the right hand side is our exhibition that we have at the end of the cruise, where everybody can look at the artwork produced during the trip. And it was through my involvement with science and with this program that I managed to be part of a 6-week voyage to Antarctica. Then stepping back about how did this all come about intellectually, and that was in 2016, I was busy photographing ice for a different project. And suddenly occurred to me, could the material itself form an image? And if it could form an image, how would that image look? How would ice see itself? This is an image I made in 2016, where after numerous experiments, I photographed reasonably successfully a globe against a red background. And at that moment, I realized that it had potential for further exploration. Moving on, over the next few years, I made various improvements. My initial photograph was in a photographic studio with, in fact, just the front standard of the camera holding the lens, the back standard holding the film, and no bellows in between. And that was partly because the ice melts and I wanted to preserve my camera as bellows from not getting soaked. But in the interim, I worked out various ways of photographing with bellows, which meant I could photograph in daylight, being a crucial aspect of my trip to Antarctica, as we were in 24 hours of daylight during the Antarctic summer. So this is a photograph of my fridge at home. I made a test portrait of myself. And again, trying to explore red, and because it was somehow easier to see, but also knowing that there was going to be very little red in the south. I photographed some buildings to try and again emulate conditions of things I would photograph were not going to be close up, but further away. And then I had a moment of doubt where I thought, is this image being made only by the aperture, only by an enlarged pinhole, or is the lens actually doing something? So I did a test outside my house, and the picture on the right-hand side is an image made just with the aperture, and the image on the left is a picture made with the lens. And you can clearly see that the lens has a different effect. if you look at the vertical lines on the building, they're a lot sharper than other areas, where an aperture-only photograph is uniformly unsharp. And then going back to this image that I made, when I thought about it, I linked it back to descriptions of atmospheric phenomena that I'd read about from early explorers, because I'd read Shackleton's South, and I thought about the various atmospheric phenomena that are described. For instance, parhelia, where there are more than one sun in the sky at once, or mirages, or showers of ice crystals, things that were kind of insubstantial and a bit surprising, because even though they existed visually, they didn't necessarily exist physically. So for me, this intellectually, I made the connection between those two aspects of my project. And even though it's not necessarily something that the viewer might understand, it wasn't important for me in terms of how I developed this notion. And so this image is by Frank Hurley, taken of the Endurance trapped in the ice. And when I looked at this initially, it's of parhelia, in fact, more than one sun in the sky. I wondered if this hadn't been manufactured in the darkroom. Because if I know nothing about photography, it's often about extending the truth or slightly misrepresenting things. But actually, when I looked again on the internet of images of parhelia, I could see that's pretty accurate. When I was preparing to go to Antarctica, I read quite a lot about from early explorers, and partly that was because the early explorers were very much more in the land itself, as opposed to sealed ships or Antarctic bases. I mean, they slept in tents. They were very much more aware maybe of the environment around them. And the thing that struck me about their writings were their descriptions of various atmospheric phenomena. And although they were primarily photographing in black and white, they wrote in color. And I'd like to just read some of the descriptions. And obviously, I also looked very carefully at the photographs of Scott's photographer, who was Ponting, and Shackleton's photographer, who was Frank Hurley. And it's quite interesting that both those expeditions had photographers assigned to them, or people whose role was specifically photographic. Whereas another text I looked at was the Swedish expedition by Otto Nordenskott, who various members of the expedition took photographs, but they're not in the same at the same level of consideration, maybe, as people who are trained photographically. So from Otto Nordenskott, as a description, he writes, "A glowing spot begins to be visible on the horizon, and presaged by a perpendicular pillar of fire, there rises what should be the orb of the sun, but which, in consequence of refraction, appears to us to be a broad, flaming, moving belt of fire. On each side of the sun, there are two shining, intensely rainbow-colored belts, forming part of a ring, which, however, can be seen imperfectly. The sun rises in the heavens and assumes by degrees his ordinary appearance, whereupon these accessory phenomena disappear. And then this description from Shackleton, where he writes about the sun coming back after being set. He writes, "The sun, which had made positively his last appearance 7 days earlier, surprised us by lifting more than half its disk above the horizon on the 8th of May. A glow on the northern horizon resolved itself into the sun at 11 a.m. that day. A quarter of an hour later, the unseasonable visitor disappeared again, only to rise again at 11:40 a.m. and set at 1 p.m., rise at 1:10 p.m. and set lingeringly at 1:20. And what I really enjoyed about finding out about these phenomena is that well, they don't make sense. They are things of fantasy in a sense. So reading further then about a mirage, a description of a mirage, and this is also from Shackleton, floating above these wavering violet and creamy lines of still more remote bergs and pack. The lines rise and fall, tremble, dissipate, and reappear in an endless transformation scene. The southern pack and bergs catching the sun's rays are golden, but to the north, the ice masses are purple. Here the bergs assume changing forms, first a castle, then a balloon, just clear of the horizon, that changes swiftly into an immense mushroom, a mosque, or a cathedral. So Shackleton and experienced things that were also not stable. They aren't fixed in the same way. When I photographed with an ice lens, the images are not fixed in the way that one would imagine they should be. Moving on then, I want to just talk a bit about the actual images themselves. When I got back from Antarctica, a few months later, we went into lockdown and I had a period of time to look at the images, think about them. So far, I've had two public outcomes of the show, of the work rather, an exhibition in a gallery in Cape Town. And then also the publication of a book that has just happened and hasn't been launched officially yet. When I looked at the actual images, I thought about what is actually happening, and I've part of thinking about them, I struggle with having to look at them on the screen, to look at them digitally, which is why for this seminar, for those of you who are here, I brought actual prints from Cape Town so you can have a look. But what does happen is there's a difference in a way of seeing. So there's some areas of the image that are sharper, hopefully a place that you can rest your eye or something to latch onto in the image, and some areas which are less focused, softer, more transient, hopefully slightly glimmering. And really, when I made the work, I had very little control about where the sharper parts fell and where they didn't. And that is really, I think, to do with a number of factors, mostly the fact that I handmade the lenses, that they melted and changed form during the time I was photographing. And then it was incredibly difficult to focus, actually, to look through the lens and see what the camera was going to see. Partly I could work around that by having a focusing cloth, but that wasn't always possible. So a lot of my thought process went into which images I selected afterwards and how I moved them and put them together. Because in the exhibition, you view the images sequentially, almost as if you're looking through a window as you walk along the row of images. And in the book, there's also a sequential control, unless, of course, the viewer flips through the book, which is not an unsurprising thing for someone to do. So some of the images are maybe more recognizable, but I also move into images that are quite abstracted and really barely there in a sense. So for instance, this one, which is the sea, the ice, and the sky. And obviously I don't really need the viewer to understand exactly what they're looking at, because the idea is that you would bring your own interpretation to the work. So in this, I just wanted to show that there are some areas that are sharper than others. And if I think, and I go back to my question about how would I see the world? I mean, in a sense, I think I would see it in a much more complex, multi-dimensional way than a single element lens. But there might be a layering over of something that one is looking at directly and one is perceiving through peripheral vision. It combined in these images. And sometimes I got surprising results, things that I didn't see when I took the picture, and I didn't see, I mean, they weren't happening in front of me in the environment, but the camera has its own interpretation of the environment. For instance, in this image, you can see there is an effect of how I focused, and that was on the foreground as opposed to the background. So most of my images were taken with ice that I took with from Cape Town and shaped into a lens. But at some point, we went through very, very thick sea ice, and the ice was turned over and scraped along the side of the ship and ended up on the deck. And I gathered some of that ice up into the lab and melted it down and made an ice lens with it, and made a number of pictures of the sea. And here as well, I imagine that Antarctic meltwater ice lens influenced the way the image was recorded. But of course it is just fantasy, because there's no reason that it should be different from Cape Town municipal water. But this is an image made with an Antarctic ice meltwater lens. And then something I've been thinking about with this project. Sorry, I just need to refer to my notes here. Is about scale, and then also the use of the panorama in photography. And when I first saw the ice shelf, I didn't recognize it. I had no frame of reference for understanding what I was seeing. So I was sitting drinking tea, and somebody came into the lounge and said, "We have arrived." And I said, "No, that's just another bank of fog on the horizon." And they said, "No, no, look again." So this is the kind of view that I experienced, and we'd been going through fog, so it wasn't that outlandish, I like to think, that I didn't recognize it. But one of the things I thought about while photographing was the difficulty in showing scale of the ice. And in the images I've shown you, sometimes it's not clear what the scale of the object is. And that is because there's nothing recognizable in the picture that shows or can give you an indication of what you're looking at. So if I look at this photograph by Hurley from Mawson's expedition to Antarctica before, well, from his book Argonauts in the South, he writes about the ice shelf as being so vast that it is really, really difficult to have a complete view of it. He said that in terms of its inaccessibleness, the ice cliffs, not so much as a foothold for over 100 miles could be found. So basically, when the ship and expedition members arrived at the ice shelf, they couldn't climb it, they couldn't penetrate it, and certainly the ice shelf is not welcoming. It if anything, it says, stay away. This is an inaccessible place for you. And then going back to some of the images that have been made, if you look on the bottom right-hand side, there's a tiny person. So that gives you a sense of scale. But actually, only through modern technology can we easily access the ice shelf. So this is an image of the Agulhas offloading cargo onto the top of the ice shelf. So one gets a sense of that scale. But in my photographs, you don't really have that sense of scale. And it's something that is elusive, and I couldn't do anything about it. Then I want to just talk about the scale also in relation to the panorama. So it's not really surprising that I thought about a panorama in relation to my experience of arriving with this strip of ice above the sea. A panorama, comes with its own historical associations, either the tourist photographic postcard, but going back in history to engravings of either cities or places that talked about power, ownership, but it also comes about through a need for the artist, if you want to include a lot of information along the horizon line or in a horizontal plane, the panorama is ideally suited to you for doing that. And interestingly, when I looked up the origin of the word, and it's something like all-encompassing view or survey of a place, and yet the panorama of the ice shelf, it can't give you the entire picture because it is so vast. And also, as you saw from the previous slide, the position, I couldn't see onto the ice over it. I was at sea level looking at a solid wall. It's inaccessible in a way. So I think there's something interesting there that I haven't quite teased out yet about the notion of inaccessibility, the way I'm photographing with something that is present and visually sharp, but also blurry and peripheral, and the format of the panorama. The pictures on the screen at the moment are from when I was on the ship and making the images, and they translate exactly into my book in two ways. So the panorama appears twice, directly after each other, but with two different readings. The first one is this is what the reader would encounter. So something that is contained and quite formally neat and maybe consumable in its neatness. And then when you open it, it is messy and chaotic and flows off the page and doesn't join up. And I think the tension between those two showings of the same photographs is something that I really enjoyed in terms of allowing the reader to choose which one they preferred, or understanding that a photographs over there is maybe different from a more experiential viewing of the land. Then this is actually my last slide, and it's the map of our trip. But I wanted to talk just briefly about the intersection between art and science, and the pleasure that I get from being involved without that much understanding, truthfully, of the scientific world. And I used an example of attending a lecture on the ship about the Aurora Australis, and I thought, wow, this is going to be so visual. And actually it was about space weather and radiation, and the flares of the sun have this incredible visual effect. And as soon as we went into the scientific part of that, I got a bit lost. But what I did get out of it was again a reinforcement of the idea that that the temperature of the air, the amount of moisture in it, can create really something that is visually incredibly arresting. Thank you. I hope you have enjoyed my talk.